All right. Hi, everybody. I am super excited to be here at the Sex Ed and Activism Panel. I have an amazing set of people here, and I'm super excited to get started and introduce ourselves. So just to get started, my name is Michaela. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm a volunteer at the RCSGD. So would anyone else like to do their introduction?
I can go. Hi, my name's Arcia. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I currently volunteer for the Women's Center.
Woo!
I can go next. My name is Bella. My pronouns are she, they, and I also volunteer for the Women's Center.
My name is Davina, and I also volunteer for the Women's Center, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
My name's Kimberly. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm also a WGSE volunteer. Hi, I'm Julietta. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm a writer for Sex Info Online.
Woo! All right, fantastic. Thank you guys so much for being here. I'm going to be moderating this event, so I'll be posing the questions, just doing a little bit of gentle guiding through all of our discussions, and our amazing panelists are going to be talking to you guys. And so will I, some occasional hot takes. So obviously sex ed is a topic that is a combination of taboo, but also everyone has stories about it. So it sort of occupies a unique space in our culture. And one thing that is sort of critical as we begin this discussion is sort of defining what sex ed means to each of us. And in addition to that, what sex ed activism is. I feel like it's a topic that people are a little bit confused about or have different definitions of. So I'm going to let you guys go ahead and go first, define sex ed in your own words and what sex ed activism means to you, and then I'll go ahead and say my definition at the end.
I can start. I would describe sex education as really an essential part of our education and of our development, of learning about our bodies, about bodily autonomy, about consent. I think it really goes beyond the body into how we negotiate for ourselves in everyday life and in our relationships. As for the activism part of sex ed, I think that means making sex education accessible to all people and looking through sex education through an intersectional lens that can be sex, gender, class, the construction of race, and so many different other factors that often aren't spoken about.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that sex ed is something that has a lot of potential to be powerful and moving and allow for a lot of growth, but I feel like it's reduced to gimmicks and like an emphasis on purity and abstinence when there's so much more room for conversation. And with that, I think that activism to me means transcending to support ideas of human sexuality and focus on empowerment as well of all people and not just, cisgendered and, heterosexual people.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And even just expanding upon this idea of purity and abstinence and all that type of a thing, I feel like often with sex education, it's mainly talked about, protective sex between a man and a woman type of vibe, and not really including those who are transgender, not including those who are queer, and then also not even talking about the idea of consent in regards to kinks and kind of like how that is with the BDSM community, and talking about, people who are poly, what that kind of means, what it means, and monogamy and all that kind of sort of stuff that is kind of pushed under the rug and not talked about within sex education.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that sex education to me means it being all inclusive, and that it doesn't stop anywhere. It means everybody and everything. and also teaching how to be safe and how to be how to keep healthy as well. And I think that sex ed activism includes all that, and being able to keep fighting for those things and keep questioning those things as well. Because if you're not going to do it, like, you can't wait for the next person to do it as well. And to just keep on to keep on like questioning things that they just don't sit right with you.
Yeah, I totally agree with what everyone has said so far. Like as everyone has said, like sex education for me, it's like it surrounds like a variety of topics, and it basically gives you the education and tools for individuals to make informed decisions about their body, their sexual health, their sexual activity, what their whole lifestyle basically. And so it's an inclusive range of information. And then sex ed activism is ensuring that like young people have the access to this education, to these different resources, to accurate information in order to make these healthy and like safe decisions about their body and the action that they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys so much. I honestly could not have said it better myself. I know a lot of people talked about sort of the structure of sex ed, the inclusivity that it sometimes misses, and just sort of how it relates to a lot of different aspects of our lives, of different people's lives. And it's like any other form of education. It's super important. Lots of folks have different ways to approach it, which we'll get into a little bit later. But yeah, and sex ed activism is sort of all about pushing for that inclusivity that folks mentioned and expanding our knowledge in ways that sort of include everyone and make space for the pursuit of different knowledge that we don't sort of grow up with in high school and middle school, those classic days that we all remember so fondly. So also before I continue, I just want to mention real quick, we are going to drop some statistics, some facts, and I just want to let you guys know that we will be sending out a document to each of you guys in the audience that has all of those resources. So if we mention something and you're like, where did that come from? We have got you covered. So speaking of things that tragically are not covered, sex ed talks about a lot of things relating to sexuality, relating to sexual health, sexual practices. But one thing that is sometimes left out that's super important is talking about consent. So does anyone want to sort of chime in with how we can create that culture of consent that we're sometimes lacking from the sex education that we get?
Yeah, I would for sure say that in order to fully expand upon consent and have this, sorry, can you repeat the part?
No, you're good. How do you think we can create a culture of consent?
Okay, so in order to create this culture of consent, I feel like we need to handle things from a political perspective, and maybe that's because I'm a political science major that I'm thinking that. But like certain policy change. For instance, I was listening to this podcast and I heard the word stealthing and I was like, what's that? So, Google that real quick. And like stealthing is the act of removing a condom during sex without the consent of a partner. And to my surprise, I'm like, okay, that sounds like sexual assault, but it's not really acknowledged as such in many countries. It is for some. It's acknowledged as sexual violence in Australia as of like May 2017, Canada as of 2014, Germany as of 2018, but it's not even acknowledged as such in the United States, which is where I'm assuming most of us might be zooming from that go to UCSB. And actually, as of like February 2021, so this year, like literally this February, Christina Garcia, which is a California Assembly member, proposed a bill that would consider it as sexual battery. So it's still being determined. It's very much fresh. So, to be determined on that and see how that ends up going. But yeah, I think that there needs to be certain policy change, and something that we're seeing in the works right now is this argument of stealthing and whether or not it's sexual assault or sexual battery.
Definitely.
I completely agree. And I think that more than that, like in addition to the political emphasis that we need to have on the idea of consent, I think that it should be a cultural shift as well. The idea that the age of consent is 18, and I don't think that's really emphasized until you're maybe 14 or 15. And there are a lot of assaults that happen much earlier than that, because a lot of kids are conditioned to do things that they don't want to do, to like give a hug to a family member that they haven't seen in a while and might not be comfortable doing. They're like conditioned to understand that adults are the people in charge, of the people who are supposed to delineate uh, the idea of consent. And I think that you should push for like body autonomy, and like children to have that sort of understanding that they can say no if they're not comfortable with something, versus just going with the flow because someone is older than you or they have more power over you. I think that's something that's really important to emphasize, and to shift that culture away from treating things like this as a taboo topic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic point.
I just also wanted to add that we should just normalize it in everyday consent and like normal and everyday conversations. And it doesn't necessarily have to be with like your partner. It can be platonic relationships. Just by like even saying like, oh, can I give you a hug, instead of just like automatically reaching in for a hug. Stuff like that, to start to normalize it in everyday life activities. And I feel like that will start to create a new culture of like talking about consent and not making it so taboo.
Yeah, definitely. Super good points. And we'll get to this a little bit later, but we are going to be talking about some sort of concrete steps we can take to improve the state of sex ed, and just things like introducing kids to the idea of what consent is at a very young age. It's not always something sexual. And just like Kimberly mentioned, it's something that can and should be incorporated into everyday life. Yeah, thank you guys so much. Those were some fantastic answers. So we're gonna shift a little bit, but still sort of talking about one of the main aspects of sex ed, and also sort of about the conversations of consent and having conversations with your partners, is about STI testing. So before we really get into it, I'm very excited to announce this is my first ever poll I've successfully created. So I'm going to send out a poll to you guys that is, how often should you get tested if you're sexually active? All right, she's officially launched. So panelists, I don't know if you guys can see this, but if you'd like to answer, you are welcome to. Or if not, I don't know, you guys are going to skew the results. I don't know if I can trust y'all. But all right, we're coming in. Okay, so our options were every month, every 3 months, every year, and every 3 years. So could one of my panelists answer the sort of correct response for this? How often should you get tested if you're sexually active?
So if you are sexually active, then the recommended rate that you should get tested is about every 3 months. And we wanted to make that distinction because a lot of the information online will recommend that you get tested about yearly, um, which is great. People should be getting tested yearly, but it's not completely accurate if you're switching partners or if you have more than one partner. It's just a safer way for everyone to make sure that they are getting tested fairly frequently. And to go a little bit more into that, I think that STI testing has been largely stigmatized, and I think that a lot of the rhetoric around it has been people asking, for example, like, oh, are you clean? Or I haven't dated anyone since X, Y, or Z, since the last time I got tested, and things like that. And it really relates cleanliness to not having STIs, which of course says that, or it doesn't say that people with STIs are dirty, but it does imply that. And that's completely false. And I think it's really harmful, especially with the rate that STIs occur with people. It's a fairly common experience that people do not deserve to be shamed for. I think that the work needs to be done in teaching people how to prevent STIs and how to get care afterwards if you do happen to get one. And I actually do think that the pandemic has been really helpful in negotiating safer sex practices, because it's really created a barrier just a moment of pause to open up these conversations where people can ask, hey, are you vaccinated? Have you gotten tested either for STIs or for COVID? And I think that we need to continue normalizing these conversations and getting tested, whether that's by yourself or going with one of your partner or partners or going with a trusted friend.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the parallel to COVID is such a good example. It's such a way to sort of normalize that idea that it's not a big deal to get tested. It is sort of a responsibility to make sure that you and your partner are being safe and making sure that you're being honest with each other. So, yeah, totally a good point.
And, I just really want to emphasize why it's recommended for 3 months. And that's because even if you're exposed to, unprotected sex and you wanted to get tested like a week later, a couple days, it's not going to necessarily appear on the test, even if you have that STI. For instance, like it takes 2 weeks for gonorrhea and chlamydia to show up.
Mhm.
Same thing with like a pregnancy test too, if that was anybody's concern. And then 1 week to 3 months for syphilis, and then 6 weeks to 3 months for HIV, hepatitis C and B. So it really varies. So that's why it's important to get tested frequently if you are sexually active, because you can't really predict when or if it will pop up.
Yeah, definitely. Super important. And also, just as like a fact that I'd like to mention, I did not know that. I was never taught that in high school about how different STIs sort of take different amounts of time to show up on the test. And I think it just sort of goes to show like, we're all people who are obviously interested in this and invested in this as a topic. But even some of us don't know some of this like basic information that's super important. So one of the things that I also unfortunately remember talking about in sex ed, I believe in middle school, was sort of talking about HIV and the AIDS epidemic. And I think unfortunately that is a lot of, if you are not a member of the LGBTQ community, that is one of the biggest things that sort of comes to mind when you're thinking about sexual practices is that really rough history. And it is one of the stigmas that exists that's really tough. So I was just wondering, does anyone want to sort of talk about where those stigmas about HIV testing stem from and maybe how we can move away from them?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the reasons why stigmas in general come up, but specifically with HIV, is because a lot of people are misinformed, or they have these very old ideas, and because things don't get like what's the word? They don't get like updated and whatnot, or you learn things from your parents or from older people, and it gets brought down to you, and that's how you think. So a lot of the stigmas I think revolve around just being ill-informed, misinformed, or having very outdated ideas of what HIV is, how you get HIV, and getting tested for HIV. And one of the ways that we can move away from that, I think, is the way that we talk about it. Um, I know a lot of people. I know that Julie was saying about like testing, like, oh, are you clean? And instead of saying that, be like, I don't know. I don't know what you said, Julie. But you said, I like that. I was like, yeah, that's it. But yeah, just the way we talk about it. I wrote down like one thing. Yeah, you just like change the language. Like saying, like, instead of saying like high risk, you say higher risk, or the more highly affected communities. Because if you say like the high risk communities, you're stigmatizing like the community that you say like, oh, they get affected the most, or they're going to get it for sure. And it's just like putting more stigma onto a really already stigmatized minority community, usually, that are the ones that are at higher risk and whatnot. So I think that's one of the ways. It's a small thing, like the way you talk about it, but it could help a lot just by the way you say certain things, switching it just a little bit. So yeah.
Yeah, totally. I completely agree. It's sort of even changing the way that we're talking can make such a big difference. And what we're doing here, is one form of that, having these conversations. But another thing that sort of sticks out to me, because I'm always on Netflix, is thinking about how these stories about members of the queer community are portrayed in television or musicals or TV shows. Television and TV shows, two very different topics. No, just in media in general. a lot of the times we sort of see these tropes, and one of the big ones is being HIV positive. And it's obviously important, and it's something that's part of our history and something that I don't think we should shy away from discussing, because it was really harmful to a big chunk of the community and really important to contextualizing where we are now. But it is sort of frustrating if you are a member of that community and that's the only story that's told about you, is this sort of tragic, like we said, this sort of like dirty thing that just sort of gets perpetuated. And it can be really harmful to people in the community, and it can be really harmful if, like me, if you were in middle school and that's sort of your first exposure to the community, is this really rough part of the history. So I think one way that we can sort of transition that discussion is by transitioning the stories we tell. And I'm a writing and literature major, so I got the bias around stories, but I do think it is a really important part of how we talk about sort of humanizing and destigmatizing and all of those really important aspects of this history. So another thing that is just sort of good to keep in mind, and I can say this like from my own experience as a queer woman, I was not given almost any guidance about contraceptive use between two cis women. And that was something that was always really confusing and always really scary to ask about in a sex ed situation, because you don't want to out yourself in that way and don't want to sort of bring up those questions. And seventh graders be giggling about anything, and that's just one thing that'll set them off. So I remember being a student and that being something that was really tough to talk about and really tough to sort of break into. So does anyone else sort of want to chime in about misconceptions about contraceptives, or just sort of pieces of information that they think are important to keep in mind?
Yeah, I think there's definitely so many misconceptions, so many myths surrounding contraceptives, like you said. And I mean, there's just so many you could talk about, but one that is I really kind of want to highlight first thing is that I think when people think of contraceptives, they think, birth control. And then when they think birth control, it's automatically like the pill, like a hormonal birth control. And I just want to make sure like that I say like there's many options of like birth control and contraceptives that are not just like the pill or just like hormonal type of birth control. So there's like the implant, IUD, there's the patch shot, there's like a bunch of other options, and that um, it's best to try to weigh the pros and cons of like side effects, right? That's another misconception, that birth control has like a bunch of these side effects, like weight gain, mood swings, all these things, right? And like, oh, it kind of steers you away from it. But I think it's best for you to do your own research, but also talk to professionals that you trust and that are knowledgeable and that you feel comfortable talking with, so you can outweigh those pros and cons, because um, then it'll be what's best for your body and whatever activities you're doing. And then also know that birth control is just not always used to prevent pregnancy. There's also many other benefits to it as well, depending on which option you pick, of course. But that's like where part of your own research comes in and what you're trying to look for. One good resource that I've used to like find like, oh, okay, now that I know there's a bunch of like contraceptives out there, like now how do I pick, right? There's like so many options now. There's a quiz on the Planned Parenthood website, and it kind of gives you like a little like quiz, and not like quiz, like a little thing where you can test and see like, oh, what am I looking for in this. And I think that's like some way to start. um but yeah, I think also just a reminder, like going back on the other topic we were talking about, like just because you use certain or like birth control, staying on the birth control topic, it's not doesn't mean you're immune to STIs or STDs. So that you should be using other forms as well, depending on whatever activity, partners, etc. So,
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that's super important. And like you mentioned, choosing the right contraceptive choice for you can be a really sort of like daunting task. Also, I'm sorry if I've got some barking in the background. But yeah, it can really be a sort of daunting task. And I know that at least for my resources, Planned Parenthood is definitely on that document that we'll hopefully be sending out. I'm trying to think if I have anything else to say about contraceptive use. Um, yeah, I think we covered it. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Um, so this is sort of shifting topics a little bit, but saying in the general same topic, because it's something that I think we all learn about and is something that's emphasized, is high school sex ed. So I think for most people, high school sex ed or middle school sex ed is sort of the like moment that stands out in your past from when you first started learning. I know for me, I was heartbroken because it started in March and my birthday's in March. And I was like, how could they do this to me? They came for me personally with the sex ed in like 6th grade. Um, so I just wanted to ask you guys, how do you think that high school sex ed sort of impacts the way that we think about these topics?
I can share something. I feel like high school sex ed is like centered around like just gender sex and very like heterosexual sex. And I feel like one of the biggest things that's missing when we talk about sex is the idea of consent and like the different emotional factors that go into it. I feel like it's just made to seem very like robotic, like penis and vagina, there you go, call it a day, and nothing else is really talked about. So I feel like that's one of the big drawbacks.
Yeah, definitely. And we talked about consent a little bit earlier, but one thing that I didn't mention was just that consent is something that's unfortunately not included in a lot of sex ed down to the curriculum level. So just to give you guys or everyone in the room just a little bit of background information. So in the United States, generally sex ed is grouped into 3 categories. So there's abstinence education, abstinence plus, and comprehensive sex education. So abstinence education is exactly what it says on the tin. It's really emphasizing do not have sex at all, generally until you're married is the background information for that. There's very little discussion about consent. There's very little discussion about how to get tested, how to deal with unplanned pregnancies, and almost certainly very limited conversation about, like we talked about, different relationships, about poly folks, about queer folks. So that's abstinence education. Abstinence plus is still mostly stressing abstinence. It does factor in some conversations about contraceptive use, about STIs. So a little bit moving towards more inclusive, but again, still stressing abstinence. And then we have comprehensive sex education, which if you're in California, chances are that's what you received. But comprehensive sex education is going through anatomy, gender identity, consent, STI testing, contraceptive use. It really sort of runs you through the gauntlet. And that's the kind of sex education that I think most of us would sort of promote as a way to sort of expand this inclusivity and really move away from creating a culture of shame around sex education. We were chatting about this earlier about sort of ways that we see sex education being represented as a form of shame. So one thing that I've seen in a couple different articles and sort of like accounts of folks who were given mostly abstinence education is like the dirty tape demonstration. And it basically boils down to like a teacher sort of has a piece of tape and sticks it on a bunch of different surfaces and it gets like dirtier. And they're like, this is what happens when you have sex with multiple people is you become a dirty piece of tape, which is obviously a horrible, horrible way to talk about one of the most like intimate human processes. But yeah, so those 3 different types of sex education are sort of generally pointed to as why the US has such uneven education is because there isn't a united curriculum around how to teach sex education, which is really sort of in my opinion where this sort of boils down to is we don't even have a like unified front on what's important to talk about. So yeah, does anyone, I've been talking about consent is one of the biggest pieces of that education and also just a really good way to sort of introduce students or even just everyday people to the idea of consent as a form of something we should practice. So does anyone else have any sort of thoughts about how sex ed impacts some of our topics that we've talked about so far in high school?
I just think it's very interesting that there are also, like, my brother is in the 9th grade right now, and he's like in his health class, and emails were just sent out where it was like, hey, like, if you want your child to opt out of, you know,
Mhm.
learning sex ed, like they can, like, let us know now. And I just think it's so interesting because it seems like core knowledge or knowledge that I think a lot of people deserve to have, and like parents reserve the right to take away that knowledge from their child in a way that, like, the Big Bang, like, learning about the Big Bang could be
Yeah.
considered controversial as well. And it's something that I think is very interesting because I think that this is genuinely health information. It's the same as like learning about drugs in school and learning what's good for you and what's not and what effects they have on your body. I
Mhm.
think that it's just interesting that high school sex ed is something that is still controlled mostly by parents and, like, other influences more than it is like uh, kids and like high schoolers learning about what they're interested in and what they can do or avenues they can take in order to be as safe as possible when they make these decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think another thing also, at least for me, just from like my personal experience, is I went to, I mean, like I think mixing religion and any type of education is a little off-putting for me. I went to a Christian high school, and they taught a lot about just like, wait till marriage, that kind of thing. But it also affected me a lot in the way that I feel I felt for a very long time very shameful of anything that I did involving sex or anything around that, even thinking about it, just because of the way it was taught. And I went to a Christian elementary school, and they taught us sex ed there, and that was actually more inclusive and better taught than it was in my high school. So it's just like after that, it kind of like affected me in a way that I just like I wasn't prepared. I felt just like being around anybody and thinking about them in a way that was like sexual was just like completely like against everything, like I'm going to hell, that kind of thing. It's they just stigmatize it a lot. And I think a lot of people that I've met that have gone to religious schools, not just Christian schools, have also felt the same way, because I feel like just mixing religion and sex just it never works out, and you end up with more pregnancies. Really, I mean, like the pregnancies at my school were just they skyrocketed. So I just think that it doesn't help that much. But I mean, that's the whole separation of church and state, but that's a whole different.
Right. Whole other can of worms. Yeah, and just super good point. Thank you so much. And just sort of one of the things that I think a lot of abstinence programs emphasis is the like, well, you won't like get pregnant if you don't know how to get pregnant, which is just like not, you think about that for like 5 seconds, you're like, hold on. But just as like a fact for you guys to know, it has been proven many, many times that abstinence education does not prevent pregnancies and does not lower STI transmission. So I think that's a big misconception, is there's sort of the idea that if you learn about sex, it will mean that you want to have it more, which is just a major misconception. And I think it's really sort of speaks to how fearful a lot of our culture is around the idea of introducing like the concept of sex to kids, which is really what it is. But it's one of those things where it's sort of it has to be talked about at some point. And I think creating that sort of environment that's a safe education to talk about it, making sure that you have a resource that's an adult that can be trusted, making that a resource available to everyone starting at like a middle school level, it can be something that's so valuable and important. So yeah, so definitely super good points. Thank you guys so much for sharing. Um, so we are sort of getting just about to the end of our discussion. So I just want to let you guys know that we have set aside about 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A and just for an open discussion for anyone who's in the room who's hanging out with us. Thank you so much. And we have been recording thus far. I should have mentioned that a little earlier, so I apologize for that. But we will stop recording at the Q&A section in case there's anyone who wants to come forward but maybe doesn't want to be recorded, just to let you guys know. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat. So our last big question that we sort of wanted to talk about, we've talked a lot about sex education, about different things that we learned or maybe didn't learn. Um, so I think ending on a note that is about action and about sort of how we move forward from where we are now is always a good way to end these kinds of discussions so that we have some motivation and some sort of momentum to take us forward. So I just wanted to open the space to all of our panelists to answer this. What do you think are some key ideas to keep in mind as we move forward to improve sex education, or any action steps that you think we could take to sort of really make those changes concrete?
I think that one of the biggest things that you can do is keep conversation open and make sure that you are a comfortable presence for the majority of people. I think that a lot of conversations could be had if we could speak up and say, "Hey, we want to hear more about this during our sex ed," and even keep things anonymous to maintain that integrity and privacy that people expect during education within this K through 12 realm of things. I think that keeping an open conversation is super important. And I also think that in general, emphasizing empowerment, emphasizing that your body is what you want it to be and you can make the decisions, is something that I think I would really appreciate if it were emphasized. And I also think that it does start at home, like that same idea that I'm going to reiterate again of making sure that your children are doing things that like they are comfortable doing and not just because someone else told them to do that. I think that these values are really important when emphasizing sex ed.
I want to expand on that and even say, not just talking with your family, but showing that this matter, like you're passionate about it on social media and giving it, I don't want to say clout, but like kind of clout, you know, like get people talking, show these politicians that this subject matter matters, because politicians, I mean, like, I shouldn't be throwing shade at my own major, but like all they freaking care about is getting reelected. And if they want to like, like please the public, show them what they need to please. Show them that this subject matter matters and that you want change. Because at the end of the day, if them signing that little bill gets them reelected, they're like, okay, cool.
Definitely.
I'll go off of that and say, yeah, exactly. Yeah. You got to just keep you got to keep pushing it. You got to keep questioning it. Everything that doesn't make sense. You keep pushing it, keep questioning, keep making it a topic of conversation. And hopefully once anything changes, gets signed into a law, then there's ways of regulating as well, because you can say that you're going to do something, but if there's no regulation to follow up on it, then I mean, things sometimes don't even happen. So definitely agree with Davina on that one. Yes.
Yeah, I love how y'all are bringing up so many different aspects that sex ed is a part of. It's a part of policy, it's a part of your home life. And I also think that as for the sex education that's in schools, I think that as we've been talking about over and over again, that sex ed in schools needs to include consent and pleasure and just how to make an informed choice whenever you do decide to have sex or you decide that you don't want to. Everyone deserves to have medically accurate, comprehensive education um, on the policy front, on the educational front, and on the home life front.
I couldn't agree any more like with you guys, but one other thing I guess I would say is to encourage fluidity in the education part. Everything is always evolving, so always working to changing, language or how we approach certain topics, or like just keeping in mind to be as inclusive as possible and understand that, as life goes on, things, happen and we can always improve. So even if we get these policies, also don't stop there. Like, keep working towards stuff too. I think that's just a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys so much for all of those amazing suggestions. I think for me, one of the things that I would love to see is, like everyone mentioned, some policy changes and just sort of creating a resource across all of the states so that we don't sort of have different states or even different counties teaching sex education. Maybe one place gets abstinence only education, another place gets comprehensive sex education. And that can be a really big barrier to a lot of folks for getting those resources. So finding ways to expand that knowledge and creating sort of a safety net for everyone as just a way to have that access to that information, I think would be a super fantastic step. So yeah, thank you guys so, so much for all of these discussions. I'm so excited. I think we had some amazing points brought up. So we are right about at that 15 minutes-ish left. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording. So just as a final for when this gets posted later, thank you guys so much. Thank you for everyone in the audience. Yeah, and fantastic.